Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to take a look into the broad topic of economic upgrades. Are all of them worth getting? And if they are, then which should have a higher priority? We'll cover everything from lumber and mining camp techs to the market, and also briefly touch on the town center and mill upgrades at the end. Now, there are a ton of rules of thumb depending on the specific strategy, and we'll talk about conventional wisdom as it comes up. But I'm also going to include a more analytical approach and focus quite a bit on the different upgrades payoff time to see how they compare. The intention here isn't to make a definitive guide for the perfect time to pick up ecotechs in every situation, but more to present some general principles and offer a slightly different perspective. So with that, let's start with the lumber camp upgrades. The first is of course double bit axe, costing 100 food and 50 wood. With 12 lumberjacks, which I think is a reasonable estimate for early to mid feudal age, and keeping in mind the tech takes 25 seconds to research, you're looking at about 3.5 minutes for double bit axe to pay off. That can change a bit based on the lumber camp placement and your exact number of villagers on wood, so we won't treat this as an exact time, and instead just say anywhere between 3 and 4 minutes is a decent rule of thumb. Now, double bit axe is widely considered one of, if not the most important ecotech to prioritize early, and as we'll see throughout the video, this is a great payoff time, and a tech you almost universally want to prioritize getting in feudal age or just after clicking up to castle in a fast castle strategy. The next wood upgrade is bow saw, which is a little more expensive and takes longer to research, but at the same time, you'll probably have more villagers when you get it, which helps it pay back faster. If we assume you have 15 lumberjacks, keeping in mind its 50-second research time, bow saw should pay off in about 4 minutes. If you have 20 lumberjacks instead, that changes to more like 3:15. This may be a bit optimistic and assumes a very good woodline, but either way, it's going to still pay back very quickly and is a great argument for prioritizing it whenever you can. As for two-man saw, off the top, it's considerably more expensive and takes even longer to research, while also giving just half the effect of the previous two. Remember though, you're probably going to have a lot of lumberjacks by the time you're in Imperial Age. It's hard to imagine a unit composition where you could get away with fewer than 20 on wood, or would need more than 50 lumberjacks, and using those as the extremes, that puts the payback time of the tech somewhere in most cases between 5 and 9 minutes. It won't pay off as quickly as the earlier techs, so it's probably a bit lower priority, but generally the lumber camp upgrades as a whole give a great return on investment, and it's obvious why players often prioritize at least the first two upgrades. Next, let's take a look at the mining camp, where you have 2 upgrades for each of gold and stone. The first level of upgrades each cost 175 resources and take 30 seconds to research, though unlike the first 2 wood upgrades, they only add 15% to collection instead of 20. Assuming you're making double range archers, you need 7 or 8 on gold, which would put the payoff time at somewhere around 8 minutes. That actually seems quite long for a feudal age upgrade to pay back, and is at least part of why a lot of players choose not to prioritize the tech in at least feudal. Food is also a bit harder to get in feudal age than gold, and accounts for most of the cost for castle age, which together also support not picking up the gold mining tech as soon as it's available. Eventually though, in Castle Age, if you have 12 or more gold miners, as you would with double stable knights, it pays back in closer to 5 minutes, so certainly by that point it's worth trying to sneak in. As for stone mining, stone collects a tiny bit slower than gold, but the numbers come out pretty similar. Unless you have more than 12 on stone, the payback time is longer than 5 minutes, and there's probably better upgrades to grab early on. That said, arguably the tech is less about payoff time and more about getting stone as quickly as possible to build your first castle. With 7 villagers, if you pick up stone mining just as you start to mine, you'll reduce the time it takes to collect the 650 stone for a castle by about 30 seconds. In a case where you really want a castle up quickly, that alone could be worth the mining tech's 175 cost to you, even if it only leads to an extra 70 stone collected in the short term. Either way, for the feudal mining upgrades, if you want a reasonable 5-minute payback, then 12 or 13 villagers seems to be the sweet spot, and any fewer than 8 miners, in my opinion, becomes difficult to justify. Switching to the second tier of mining upgrades, with gold shaft mining for an under 8-minute payoff on the invested resources, which again I'd consider a bare minimum, you need at least 14 villagers on gold. To get it down to a 5-minute payoff for the tech, you need more like 25 villagers. As wide as that range is, you could really make an argument for anywhere within that band, depending on your time horizon. And while that seems like a lot of gold miners for Castle Age, by Imperial Age you'll very likely be at a point that's justified. For comparison, remember with bow saw we only needed 15 lumberjacks for a 4-minute payoff, which is just to emphasize how strong the wood upgrades look in comparison. Another important question though is, at what point is there not enough gold left on the map to bother picking up the tech? On a typical 1v1 map like Arabia for example, you have 15 gold piles around your starting town center that are technically yours. So how much of that do you need to use up before it's not worth picking up gold shaft mining anymore? Well, if you have 14 gold miners and pick up the gold shaft mining upgrade just as you start to mine, after about 8 minutes, you'll have collected 350 more gold than if you hadn't gotten the tech. Unfortunately, at this point though, you've permanently paid 350 resources to get the tech in the first place, and what you got out of it besides a bit earlier gold was roughly a minute of idle villagers at the end. You haven't increased the total amount of gold, and a player without the tech will eventually catch up, all while saving their food and wood. To do this properly, we need to put a value on the villagers' idle time, and after accounting for the fact those villagers could be switched back onto food or wood a bit earlier, the math implies that gold shaft mining is eventually going to pay back for itself as long as you have at least roughly 3,200 gold left to mine, which for context is 4 gold tiles. Considering you should have 12 to 15 gold piles available, all this to say gold shaft mining is very often still worth picking up even if you mined quite a bit of gold already, and is not something I'd worry about in most cases. Switching now to stone shaft mining, in some ways we get a very different story. Things start by looking similar, needing 27 stone miners to recover the total resource cost in 5 minutes, or 15 miners to have a sub 8-minute payback. Now first of all, that is a lot of villagers on stone. Even 15 sounds like a lot to me, and very often stone miners are sent to build castles, so stone is actually collected less continuously with high villager numbers than other resources. Beyond that, again, the question is whether or not there's enough total stone on the map to make the tech worth it, and that's where things get interesting. With a similar method to before, using 15 villagers, you don't actually come out ahead until you mined a little over 3,000 stone from the map after clicking the tech. The problem is, that's basically all of the stone around your starting town center. There is another couple thousand in neutral stone, but realistically, if you've already collected enough for a castle and a few town centers, you're going to be lucky just to break even in the long run. To be clear, that means after speeding up our stone miners and finishing the stone on the map early, they're unlikely to be able to use that extra time to recuperate the wood and food that the tech cost in the first place, meaning the tech was a net loss. That said, if you place basically no value on food and wood because you're drowning in those resources and care only about getting stone quickly, then stone shaft mining may have a place. Or if the map has an unusually large amount of stone, it'll start to look better in the long run. Putting those together, the short answer is that gold shaft mining is very often worth it, though probably not at the start of Castle Age, while stone shaft mining, on the other hand, feels like a tech that is often easy to justify skipping over entirely. But now that we've done the lumber and mining camp upgrades, I want to quickly touch on the Burgundian civilization. I don't want to bloat this video with civilization exceptions, but Burgundians in particular are at least worth mentioning in passing. They get all of these techs and age earlier, while also costing half as much food. As a very general rule, many of these techs cost roughly 1.5 times as much food as wood, which means Burgundians are getting the same payoff times with about 30% fewer villagers. For bow saw or gold mining, you very well may have enough villagers to justify those techs in Feudal, and bow saw with 12 lumberjacks, for example, looks almost as appealing for Burgundians in Feudal Age as double bit axe for a generic civilization. Next though, let's take a look at the fishing tech Gillnets. This can reasonably add 20 to 25% to collection rate depending on how far the fishing ship has to go. Deep sea fish collect the fastest, but you often end up losing efficiency as you fish further away. For both reasonably close big fish and fish traps, to get a conservative 5-minute payoff, you need 15 or more fishing ships, and for a more long-term 8-minute payoff, you need 9 or 10. The main point is just that if you have a handful of say 4 ships, then we're talking about 16 or 17 minutes for the tech to pay for itself, and in that case, there's probably better things to prioritize. With a more serious fish boom on tons of traps though, it's definitely an automatic pickup. But now let's switch to the market techs, which technically count as economic upgrades. Starting with Caravan, a full trip along a side of the map without the tech on a 3v3 map takes about 6.5 minutes. In practice, it wouldn't be quite this smooth, but theoretically to get an under 5-minute payoff, you need just 11 trade cards. There's a reason that almost everyone starts trade with getting Caravan first, as it'll pay for itself many times over. With even a modest 24 trade cards, you'd be getting the full 200 gold cost of the tech back every minute. As for coinage and banking, picking these up can be a bit of a hassle if you want to send resources to an ally, but in some cases is definitely worth waiting for. The tribute fee by default is 30%, meaning if you try to send 100 resources, only 70 go through to your ally. To break even on the tribute techs, you need to send about 1,700 food and 1,000 gold, or something comparable. For a one-off small tribute, that obviously won't be worth it, but if you're slinging an ally or want to consistently support them with resources totaling over 3,000, it's probably worth investing in early. Technically, banking is actually giving a slightly better deal for its food cost, so there really isn't any obvious reason I can see to ever stop at Coinage when both techs are available to you. Also at the market, you have guilds, which gives better prices for buying and selling resources. This is another one where there's a bit of a delay to research, but an argument for some long-term value. Normally, the bottomed out price for resources at the market is 14 gold per 100 resources sold, which guilds changes to 17. In that situation, guilds is worth the equivalent of 242 gold, so you'd have to sell at least a combined 8,000 food or wood to justify it. That number may be difficult to believe, but remember you're only getting 3 extra gold for every 100 food or wood sold. The tech has 200 gold in its cost, so that takes a lot of selling to earn back before you're getting any benefit in real terms. Next, let's talk about the town center, where you have 2 techs, Wheelbarrow and Hand Cart. I've done a video on both of these techs not that long ago, where I go into far more detail. They're a little more complicated than just when they pay back, as they come at the cost of creating extra villagers. The short answer is Wheelbarrow, I think, makes the most sense to get when you have 16 to 18 farmers or you're accidentally housed. For Hand Cart, you need to factor in missing out on 2.2 villagers, but accounting for that, the research time, and Castle Age gather rates, with 30 farmers, 30 lumberjacks, and 20 miners, you have just under a 5-minute payout for Hand Cart. Based on that, I'd say there's nothing wrong with an 80 villager rule for a quick payoff, or if you're okay with a bit longer 8-minute payoff, that works around 50 villagers. Considering you're creating new villagers as well, both of those are probably overestimates. Either way though, that feels like the most general range where the tech would make sense to pick up if you can comfortably afford it. But finally, we'll finish up at the mill. Now, I've also gone in depth with these upgrades before as well, outlining why I don't think a payoff time is the perfect way to think about them. Just for completeness sake and to not send you out hunting for that video though, we'll touch on it here. The mill upgrades work by delaying farm reseeding by several minutes depending on which one we're talking about. If we ask how long until the mill upgrades pay off, there's really a few ways to interpret that, but one way is to ask how long until you notice some kind of benefit. For Horsecollar, it's about 10 minutes at the very earliest. Since existing farms aren't affected when you research the tech, assuming you get Horsecollar immediately before placing a farm, 10 minutes later is when you'll notice instead of having to reseed your exhausted farm, you can delay having to do that by about 4 minutes. You could say that's the tech paying off, and that time is more like 12 and 15.5 minutes for the other 2 techs. Of course, the delay is for hundreds or potentially thousands of wood, as it's 60 wood for every farm. Personally, I like to prioritize Horsecollar and Heavy Plow if I can early on, and it's especially satisfying to sneak in Horsecollar before building my 3rd farm. That said, with crop rotation specifically, the 15-minute delay between researching and feeling its effects makes it considerably less appealing. It's also much easier to float extra wood at that point in the game, and delaying farm reseeding doesn't feel very impactful, so generally I see this more as an optional tech. So to put it all together, for me the simplest benchmark is the 5-minute payoff. That won't necessarily be the case for everyone, and leans more toward having higher villager numbers, where in a purely booming situation you could justify techs much earlier. Here's a fairly simple summary for each upgrade though, keeping in mind there's a lot of context that isn't captured here, both in terms of things I mentioned throughout the video and other situational factors that didn't make it in. I wouldn't treat any of these as hard rules, but more as context behind why certain technologies are picked more often than others. That'll do it for this one though. Big thanks to Jean-Paul, Brian, James, Kyle, John, Jockster, Samantha, Justin, Yaos, and everyone else on Patreon for their generous support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.